About her. Thank you. Somebody remembered the recording, which I forgot. Thank you so much. I do tend to forget these all the time. So Marie is going to tell us a bit about both her background, but also her experience and some of her tips and ideas about how you can think about getting research funding for your research. Marie, over to you.
Thank you so much. That was one of the best introductions someone has done for me in a while because yes, it's quite a lot. It's kind of impressive. Like I myself, I'm impressed because in my head, I'm still back at a different point where I want to start my story today, which is how I like my journey to become a researcher and how I knew that this would be the job that I want. Because in university, I can't exactly say I have a working class background, but definitely not a strong academic background. Neither of my parents went to university. At the time I entered university, my mother started later, but it's a different story. So I hadn't really a concept of a researcher as a job, and I like to proceed with these things. And then I had kids very young. While I was still in my undergraduate is when I had my first two kids. And then I graduated, and I was absolutely inexperienced. At some point, I kind of ended up knowing I want to do a PhD. And for a while, I had in my biography a few years later, role model by accident, because for me, it was kind of, it feels like a series of accidents or like by circumstance. Um, I had a good idea. I drafted a project proposal. I Googled how to write an expose. And this is already my number one tip. There's a lot of resources out there, and do actively look for them. They can really get you a long way. Because a lot of what I did was kind of self-taught, and I just moved through the world of information that there is on academic careers. So I have over 15, if not more, rejections even after job interviews at the beginning of my career. And this is also something I like to proceed with. Yeah, my idea was good, but clearly in the interviews I behaved extremely awkward. I could fill a whole fuck up night just with stories of how badly I fucked up these interviews. I wrote lots of other applications to places that were clearly not suitable for what I was planning to do. And then eventually and the foundation that funded eventually my PhD was kind enough to let me know that I was basically getting the place of someone else who had declined the funding. So I wasn't even first pick. But that was basically my entryway. And already that application for that grant came at the end of a long series of rejections. And that was the first time where I had started more actively reaching out to people. Kindly enough, some of the people who rejected me for jobs said, "We see your potential, but you're not there. If you send me your expose, we can work on it together." So that was good. And you need to be prepared when someone offers you a branch like this, obviously. So I jumped on it, and I knew that this was really serious. And then I also started reaching out to people saying, how do I even do a grant application? What needs to go in there? It's like, okay, writing an expose, but if you apply for a grant, even if it's just a PhD scholarship, more things matter. And that's what I would call the holy trinity of successful grant applications. Is the idea needs to be good, and very clearly, I would say almost everything we do as researchers, there needs to be a large intrinsic motivation, and that comes because you are very invested in an idea that you had, that you found a curiosity that you have, right? If that's not at the heart of what you're doing, you're not going to be able to carry on throughout the series of, well, rejections or waiting periods in timelines that are impossible to kind of add up and make work with each other. So you need intrinsic motivation. And just research itself, it has frustrating moments and loops, yeah, because that's just part of the thing. So you need to have a good idea. But apart from that, your CV needs to be in the right place, and I'm going to say more about that later. And the project, and this is particularly relevant for grant applications, the project needs to be described in a way that whoever you're addressing your pledge for funds to, that whoever or whatever institution, that they can compute, and that it fits with their aim, that it fits with their rationale. And this is quite crucial, in my opinion, to understand. So to stick with the example of the PhD scholarship very briefly, is that not only did I have to basically give an expose about what am I planning to do with this PhD project, what do I see at the end of it, what am I planning to research, there's always at the very end of every grant application comes the more practical section where you write what do you do, and then at the even after that, usually an appendix, comes the section where you have to write what kind of resources you need for that. And that's really where it gets very crucial, because this is where the people assessing these proposals, yes, they will of course make sure it's an interesting idea, it brings something new to the field that you're embedding yourself in, et cetera, or that you're intervening. But they also want to know, we're giving a lot of money to someone, will this work? Do they have an idea how to actually do what they're thinking of doing? And so if you're not at the point where you have a very concrete idea, and because I had gone through so many rejections, I had a pretty good idea, and they said, I want to like travel to that country, and I want to travel to that other country, and I want to look at those files. And then in my appendix, I could say very nicely, here's the amount of travel I will do. And here's some other resources I need, because I also want to visit international conferences. And these were all things at the beginning of my PhD. I had no idea a scholar needs to do all of these things. And I learned this from other postdoctoral scholars who said, your travel budget is way too small. That was definitely hands down one of the best recommendations I ever got. So easily double whatever you put in there, or even more. And you can turn to colleagues, whatever like the going rates are, because very typically funders do want to cut some of the amount that you ask for. That's just how the process is. And then you put in more than you want. And also travel is more expensive, right? There's like inflation, flight tickets can rise, whatever. So this is how I made my way. And then after my PhD was kind of another round of unsuccessful applications. I didn't manage to land a position somewhere. So I turned to the next grant, really, because I had an idea. I knew I had to have one somehow. And then I got a small postdoctoral grant. And that's when I actually received my first funding, the national funding from the DFG for a 3-year project, one woman show, but I was the PI on paper. I had my own money. I needed to do the whole admin work and project administration. I had signing power on this budget. I had hiring power for research assistants. And at one point, while I was at the beginning of this grant, I did a workshop on, oh my God, I think it was time management or so at my university. Also do those, they're great. They're like all the free resources your university is offering you, do those. Because there I met a person who worked in the research administration department. He said, well, you're really well positioned to apply for an ERC starting grant. And that's how I learned about an ERC starting grant. He was like, our university loves those because they come with the biggest overhead. Now, what is overhead? Probably most of you are familiar with that. The funder gives you a large amount of money, and for most of that money, you can do whatever you want. You can hire people, you can pay yourself and whatever, but the university gets to keep a part of that to, well, pay their own people, pay for the rooms, the heating, the nice computer they're giving you, whatever. So universities are terribly interested in this. In Germany, the average university's household has only about 60% funding coverage from what the government gives to the university. And we're talking here about the core household. So really like facility managers, electricity bills and whatever. 40% of that have to come from external funding that the researchers employed, the professors at the university bring into the university, or else the university cannot actually keep their doors open. So that explains the pressure. This will vary from country to country, from institution to institution. I'm giving you a breakdown of how it was for me. And then this is one of the assignments I would give, is find out how this works at wherever your institution are. So I learned about the ERC grant. I even learned that the university has seed funding, which was extremely non-competitive. I had to send a one-page proposal of what I want to do. And because I already had met the guy and he was sympathetic, I think he just waved it through. And that was 25,000 euro. And that was the beginning of my success to the successful journey all the way to the ERC, which took me, I think, 6 years altogether. Because then I really got into it That's also when the pandemic hit, and I was severely incapacitated with all of the plans I had for my aviation research project. And I mean, coming out of the PhD already being funded, I understood, and this is something that I also learned from people working in the movie industries or film industry, is that the first thing you do when you get a grant is that you apply for the next one. Yeah. And you really need, so the time I was talking about timelines adding up, because when you think about how long it takes to actually conceive of an idea and then find the right funder and then understand where your CV still needs, where you need to fill up a couple of gaps, maybe in your CV, strategically speaking, or publications or whatever, or and you understand that this funding line typically expects this and that kind of thing that you may not have. Or maybe you need to clarify things for the project itself. Do you need research permits? Do the kind of archives you imagine that you can research, do they actually exist? So you start that from the beginning of a new project, you set aside time to make the next project, and you use some of those funds that you now have and some of the flexibility. And that's the endless cycle that once you're on, and yeah, like with many things, you kind of want to make that probably the first threshold can be the hardest to get. So get yourself enough funding to have enough resources to then build towards bigger funding. Okay, so but I'm sharing some of this biography, and I'm coming to an end in a second, is because one thing that I also found, and why did I keep pursuing this? Because throughout my career, there is a continuity in that, just how I was positioned in life with my background, with my, I don't seem like it now, but I'm really terrible at interviews. So with my like social awkwardness or my difficulty to read the specific social situation of job interviews, and then all the bias, the structural institutional bias that like against women who already have children, who don't have a strong, like an academic household where they have prior knowledge of just how to behave in these spaces, etc. So I didn't have any of this. And I found that grants are much more transparent and accessible than traditional hiring hierarchies for me. This is what I found. And until this day, this year, I put in 4 applications for professor jobs in Germany, and I did not get invited for a single one of them. And right now, I'm actively negotiating a tenured position with 3 universities at the same time, because I have 2 million euros under my belt. But still, my CV and how I'm networked, which has helped me greatly, has kind of not, it's kind of, I'm like, yeah, I'm not ideally positioned to make it to career-wise for the conventional ways. This is what I'm trying to bring across. And I personally found that the grants, they have built-in mechanisms. For example, if as a woman with children, you apply for an ERC grant, how long you're actually eligible for the starting grant, which is what I did, where you were and your profile is assessed as a junior researcher's profile. And that has a certain cutoff 7 years after the PhD normally. And as a woman with children, they automatically give you 1.5 years per child that you have. So they're actively saying, we understand that because you have kids, it's going to take you longer to have the same amount of publications, the same amount of leadership skill experience, etc., the same amount of talks that you've given. It's going to take you longer, and you don't need to prove this to us. I just needed to submit birth certificates of my kids. That was all. Whereas men have to they have to submit documentation that they took paternity leave. Okay, so this is a mechanism. It's nice if the university has a DEI strategy, did I say it right? Yes, DEI strategy or whatever, where they all express their good intentions. But this is like a hard fact that I could benefit from. Anyway. So, and I think this can be true for other people who experience the discrimination because of structural bias. I think grants are more fair in some ways. They're also, they have their downsides, and they're hard to get. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. Yeah. So, and I have been rejected for grants, but not nearly as many as I have been rejected for jobs, or not even invited for jobs, or not even being considered. Yeah, I'll stop here because I want to give you a chance to have more targeted questions. Stop here, maybe adding the caveat. So I'm a historian, also by my position, and I applied for the ERC Starting Grant with a historical project. That this is kind of a business history project is a nice coincidence, but I think it was easier for me to frame it as a business history project, but still apply to as a historian. Say, as a historian, I think we should really do business history than if you were to try to do this from the other way around. But I can say more on that if you have questions, but maybe you have other questions that pertain to other aspects of all of this.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you. That's really helpful, and it's also really great to hear that, you know, your personal CV has not necessarily been straightforward, and that your experience of grants has actually been, in some ways, really positive because it allowed you to sidestep some of the problems. I think, I mean, I realize people are here from sort of other countries in the world. I mean, for the UK, certainly we have a similar problem where overheads are very desirable because the fees we get for home students only cover 60% of their cost. For us, the pressures then go much more into international student recruitment. So it is a slightly different game, but I think ultimately we're all applying to similar funders. But I did want to hear a little bit more before we open up for questions. Why have you focused so much on getting grant funding throughout your career and for your research project? Was this more because this was the best option out there? It sounds like at some point it became a thing that you realized was a specific strength for you. So how did you get that focus on always looking for the next grant?
So I would say, and what I also observed is that people, even people who had really nice positions, often they don't have the kind of independence and freedom to move. I saw people fighting for budgets to, you know, like invite, like to take invited speakers to dinner after the talk or whatever, like so really small sums, and how this ate up huge amounts of time at universities. And I felt it's definitely a good idea to just position yourselves with some funds that independently just belong to you. And either you're independently wealthy, and then which also more professors than you think are, and they just invite speakers out of their own pocket. Also something you only learn if you hang around long enough, right? But isn't it nice to just have some money? This also goes for extra training, for research trips I did, rather than haggling with the university about per diems or whatever. Isn't it nice if I can save everyone some time because I have my own money? So I think this really applies to everyone, and you can start small. This would be another secret hack for me, is that I shared recently with a colleague of mine. Read every newsletter to the last, down to the last line, that the university and all other associations that you're a member of, read every of those newsletters, because this is where the funding hides, not the 1.5 million. This is where the like 5,000 euro for this and that, 12,000 euro for this and that, the seed funding that I was getting. The university didn't even bother announcing that. That was just kind of, and probably not intentionally, maybe just no one had time. Everyone was overworked in the department. This was a really big German university where that suffered from a lot of structural, you know, backlog, I would say. So watch out for it, because money is lying around at every university that I've known so far, and especially those smaller things, and they're not competitive. And this is how you can start getting yourself just a little bit of freedom and wiggle room to do some of the things. And then maybe you can travel to a conference where you give a talk that will actually very nicely round out your profile when you apply for that bigger grant. Yeah, it can really, so that's why I focused on grant. They give me independence, and like I said, for me, I found them more transparent and easier to understand what do I need to do to succeed. The rules seem just so much clearer than for the traditional hiring route.
Okay, thank you. I've just seen Amar's got a question that probably directly relates to that. Amar, do you want to just ask your question? You're on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. my question is that like I'm a PhD student, final year PhD student in business administration with specialization of accounting and finance. So if I need to, because now I have no supervisor, unfortunately my supervisor has some clash with the university, so he changed the university. So I'm without supervisor like. So
Sorry to hear
if
that.
so if I want to get any funding for specific project, because I have some publications also. So based on this experience at this stage, I am able to applying for the any funding, or is it better I after completing my PhD I will apply? Because I have no much experience. Just now my age is 30 years, and just I have 2 year university teaching experience, and after that I can start my PhD.
So this is where I would come back in and say these kind of things, when it comes down to that level of detail, they can vary greatly between even universities within the same country and between countries, most definitely. They can vary greatly between disciplines. A lot of funding lines are discipline specific, and especially smaller funding line. And here I'm
Yes.
going to come in with another thing that I learned actually in that workshop where I learned about the ERC grant in a lunch break.
Yes.
It's really good to have an overall 10-year or so plan. This sounds like an intimidating strategy, but you need to have an idea where you want to go. And I've been where you are. I'm like, I want to go anywhere where they'll have me. Yeah. And
Yes.
I'm like, I'm really good. Take me. I'm a good worker, and I will have any sorts of ideas wherever you put me. So this was challenging for me. You need to work through that a little bit and dare to lean into just making a plan. You don't need to stick to it. It's your
Yeah.
personal plan. And then you will have a much clearer idea where you can turn to for resources and people who can help you answer these questions, because there's a lot of funding that PhD students can apply to. Usually it's smaller things like travel grants, conference travel grants. Sometimes it's writing up scholarships that I don't know if that exists in the UK. So sometimes libraries give something that is called like a research grant, which could in fact for you mean it's a writing up grant, because it helps you to write up your dissertation, because it just buys you 3 months of time where your basic living expenses are covered. I will say that I'm not involved enough to understand the problem with the supervisor, but this is also something you should address this to the university and make sure that, formally speaking, that everything is how it should be for you. But no, and I would strongly advise to prefer grants that you can apply for independently, and not grants that where you need to go through a supervisor. This goes across the board for all levels. You're always better positioned if you have your own money. Yeah, it also looks better on the CV. You have your own money, and you're not. This is also this independence I was talking about. Yeah.
Yes, sure. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
It might be useful. I mean, just as Marie said, query with the university. They normally do have to provide you with the supervisor. And that's maybe the most urgent thing, but also worthwhile if you're specifically accounting and finance. The disciplinary line funding is
Yeah.
also often less competitive and easier to get,
Yes.
and particularly if you're accounting finance, so quite quants. Often insurances, for the UK, there's a lot of funding from AXA. And you might have to look China, India, you might have similar companies that are willing to give grants, particularly to people with your very specific skill set.
Yes.
And a lot of people don't know about them. And that's really sort of where Marie's kind of pointing out that strategic orientation and also that knowledge. Like a lot of the time, all we're looking at are the big funders, but actually it's much better if you start with the smaller, more specific ones.
Small amount. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Most universities have, on several levels, people assigned to it's their specific job to advise you about grants and these kind of difficulties and like financing difficulties. The struggle is real. I know the system doesn't seem like it, but everyone working in the university on a permanent job is very aware of that, and they're very prepared to help you. And there's more in place than it seems. Yeah. So not only will your university, but likely your department or your whatever chair, whatever is your unit, they might have someone that you can turn to. And if not, look the next higher up in the organizational hierarchy. And there might be, a PhD consulting or a counseling office or so, and they can help you also. And often the website points you to things and courses that are interesting. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Just checking if there are more questions. By all means, just put up the golden hand on Zoom, perfect. Nick, do you want to come in now?
Yeah, thanks, Marie. That was really interesting. I like the way you was able to kind of summarize the process of identifying opportunities and tailoring your projects to those different opportunities. But I'm interested in what the process is like after you've submitted the initial proposal. I mean, did you have any sort of rigorous feedback and review process? Did you have to revise it multiple times? Did you have an interview to defend your big grant bid or anything like that? What sort of how do you manage the process after submission but before acceptance?
Yeah. So I want to lead with a brilliant statement of a colleague of mine who said, don't forget that waiting for a big decision like this is also work. Because I was sitting there waiting and I was just not able to do any of the stuff that was piling up on my desk. And that helped me to hear. So this is big, especially when you're doing it for the first time, I think. And so what happens after you submit with the ERC grant? I submitted for the first time, and then they usually specify somewhere on their website or in their materials what the timeline will be. So when can you expect to hear back, and also what kind of feedback you're going to have. And this is also something that is really worth studying in advance. So before submission, you want to understand what exactly is going to happen. What kind of evaluation is taking place, how many steps are there, and who is doing it, and what are they deciding? For example, for the DFG, first they're sending this out to field-specific evaluation, but the actual decision who gets the money is not only based on a positive evaluation. There's then a committee, there's also a field-specific committee, but it's slightly more like broad in how it's composed. And they make their decision based on those evaluations, but they only have a limited sum of money to distribute. This is why it happens all the time that you have 2 or 3 positive evaluations and you still get a rejection because they just preferred, maybe you were number 11 on a list of 10 that they could have given the money to. So, and it's really important to understand that you need to plan for this. This is another point where the independence that I stressed so much earlier comes in. You want to position yourself independently enough that you don't depend. Yes, a lot was riding for me on this ERC grant, but this year, I was positioned well enough so that not everything was riding on me getting this grant. Yeah. And this helped me massively psychologically to not sit there. After submission, there's usually a first round of written evaluations, especially for the bigger grants. And then if you make it through that round and you're among the best 20% or so, and the ERC has a relatively transparent system where they give you points. So while I haven't personally don't know my number of points, I understood that evaluators are given a list of 20 or so points. I could also see this in the written assessments, that they were all structured very similarly. This is not necessarily the case with others. And here it also helps to ask more senior colleagues who have reviewed, to ask, how are you actually doing this? For me, I really needed, on paper, this was so abstract for me. So I talked to people. And I was also last year for the first time in the position to review grant applications myself. It was only a small grant, but it helped me massively to better understand and not take it so personal also when I get a rejection, and to understand the process. You're there, you're getting hundreds of pages that you need to work through. And yes, this was about people from African refugee camps who wanted to do a master's in Germany. I felt so much like weight riding on my shoulders that I have to contribute to this decision. But I understood immediately, easily half of the applications, I was like, no, this is not going to work. I'm sorry, I will not recommend this person for funding because it's just not, like, they don't have what it takes, or it's not a good fit or whatever. Feasibility is what I mentioned earlier. The project needs to be described well, also to a person outside of your field, ideally outside of research. Yeah, oh, you want to do this? How do you want to do it? And then you say 2 or 3 sentences and people need to say, oh yeah, that sounds about right. Right? So this is kind of the benchmark. So I got invited to an interview with the ERC. For the DFG, there wasn't an interview stage, which is I would always give preference because I hate interviews, as I've said. So for this interview, it's infamous and very short, very structured. They give you 18 minutes and then they throw you out of the Zoom call after that. And they give you lots of, so I prepared massively. I prepared not just 1, but 2 different voice and rhetoric coaches. I did mock interviews, but this is also me having lots of bad interview experiences. Other people might wing it a bit more easily. You have 3 slides. You have 3 slides, not more, not less. My whole family, which has 2 artists in it, was sitting around the day before the interview with me, composing and making sure, you know, that we have slides that are well readable, not overloaded with information, etc. My 19-year-old daughter did beautiful handwritten illustrations, and you know what? It was all worth it, and it gave me confidence to show up with an extremely good deck, right? So, and personal. It needs to be personal. So I trained a lot, and it paid off. Yeah, this was the hardest 18 minutes of acting I had to do in my life, I think, where I had to, like, you know, pretend that I'm extremely confident and that I didn't mind at all to have, you know, a scientific debate about what is the future of my life. So I want to say, maybe if I want to give a tip on this, is you need to make sure that you are in a place in life where you can bring that kind of like mental stability to the process. If you have, and this, it's very sad for me to say this, if you have 100 other things going on in your life, precarity, private life, health problems, this is going to be so much harder. And because it is draining, these processes are draining. We can also discuss whether it's appropriate or fair, how much resources you need to bring. But for me, this is why it was so good for me in hindsight that I had kind of worked my way up the hierarchy of grants, because I knew that there is this process, and I had gone through the process of being rejected, of then revising a proposal, resubmitting it. And the first time I applied for the ERC, I submitted and I got rejected first round, which is then you're actually banned from applying for the next 2 years if you're too bad. So that's how bad I was. But yeah, I got very extensive detailed reports, which is also not the case for every type of funding. Sometimes you will just get a rejection. Sometimes you will get something that is like a half page that doesn't tell you much. Or worst case, it'll tell you the project is great, we just didn't have enough money.
Before I go to Anna, can I sneak in a quick question? Because you mentioned rejected grant proposals. Do you have a strategy for rejected grant proposals? Because everybody who goes for grants has a lot of those.
So I would say keep working on it. Or what I sometimes like to say is, yes, there's a bit of luck and you need to probably try several runs, but it's not the lottery. If your idea is good and you're invested in it, then you will get funding for it sooner or later. The question is just when. And then a strategy that I would say applied very successfully is that you want to take a hard look at your project and identify those parts of the project that you can do anyway. Maybe because you have a little bit of small funding. Maybe there's a more low-cost version. Maybe you can host an online workshop. Maybe, you know, there's many variants in which you can then take a look at your project and say, how can I advance this already a little bit? Because this will most definitely strengthen your next round of application. Yeah, there's very few grants that have as a requirement that you haven't done anything like it, like what you're proposing beforehand. And even then, the evaluators will look at what you're proposing and they will look at your profile and they will say, do we think this person can do what she's proposing to do here? So this person is proposing to have 4 researchers on her team, to do lots of workshops, to do research in several countries, and that also research in a discipline that she's never done before. So you want to look at your own CV and you want to take a hard and strategic look and say, am I there yet? Yeah. And what can I do to make myself a more convincing person for the job? So let's say you proposed a lot of international research, but you lack an international experience. How can you bring in international experience? This is where the 10 or so year strategy comes in. Yeah. Because you want to go back and forth and understand how can all of this feed into each other in the most, you know, efficient way. How can you have synergy effects? And that way the grant proposals and the rejected ones, they're just one piece of the puzzle in your 10 or so year strategy. Right. And it's not a wasted time per se.
So you don't throw away an unsuccessful research proposal, it just...
Not at all. I only propose things where I really believe the idea is good. Well, once or twice I may have proposed things where I'm like, nah, it wasn't a good idea. And then it's also fine. Then I think shelf it or just accept it. Yeah, cut your losses.
All right. Anna, your question.
Hi, Mary. Thank you very much for sharing your experience with us. I was curious. You mentioned, that in the interview you had only 3 slides, the possibility of talking about 3 slides. So I was wondering, how do you balance this limited space, which in this case was slides, in other project proposal is limited number of words, limited number of pages. How do you balance that with instead the richness that you need to communicate about your project, why it is worthwhile, etc. And this is the first question. Another one, you mentioned that at some point, perhaps for a previous application, you had 2 panels, one specialized in your field and the other one broader. And so again, how do you write a research proposal that can satisfy both a specialized panel and a broader panel?
So disappointingly, the answer here is you need to really make sure that you have enough time and focus that you can dedicate to the proposal. Yeah, while I have churned out the grant proposal for this ERC grant that was successful, and it really only came together more concretely in the 8 weeks or so before submission. And I want to say 6 weeks before submission, I presented the project idea somewhere in a small informal workshop with a very different idea. And then people told me, don't do it. But this, obviously, all of this other stuff, and it was years in the working, and it was there. But you want to have enough time to work through something. It's like when you're writing a book or when you're writing a journal article and revising. For this to really hit the mark, the number one secret is that you need enough time and headspace to do these several rounds of revisions, and then to decide for yourself, do I want to workshop this with some other people? And not, for example, if you already know that you have a panel that will not be field specific or more broadly field specific. So let's talk about panels for a minute, because for the ERC, this is really, really key. The good thing, so this is a bigger chunk of homework if you're interested in going for the ERC, but go to the website, understand the panel structure, and not only can you understand, so the panel I applied to is called Study of the Human Past. And I was very strongly advised by several people, there is a panel for economics. I was very strongly advised not to do it because my publications, the literature I mostly speak to is just not economic field-specific literature. And this is one of these decisions that only you, really only each individual person of you can make that decision for themselves. What field? You can, of course, ask for advice, but only you know your profile best. And this is not a funding officer at the university will not understand anything about this, for example, because this is hyper-specific expertise that like you and maybe 3 other people in your department can give you good advice on this. So that's your homework, basically. And so you understand the ERC is also kind enough to let you know the panel composition of the previous year. So you get an idea. And so for Study of the Human Past, there's like paleontologists on there. Okay, there's people who do like linguistics, people from historical social sciences. So I knew I had to, and some historians. So I knew that it had to be something, and they're from all over Europe. And then the evaluations they send out, they might send this out to yet people from beyond Europe who are just field-specific experts. And then the smaller your field is, let's say post-colonial business history, there's an extremely good chance that whenever Stephanie and I submit something, it will land on each other's desks. And we will get to the point where we have to start rejecting that because we have worked together too often. And then they will scramble for other people. I mean, hopefully the field is growing, so they won't. But so this is a kind of homework you have to do, and this is what I also mean. I think this takes time. It's not something. It's also not something you could feed into a large language model, for example, because that is the kind of knowledge that sits here in your brain that has the lived experience of being a researcher in your field or in between some fields.
Thanks, Marie. That's really interesting. I mean, if I maybe can follow up particularly on the panel composition thing, because I find, in my experience, if you're a business historian, that gets you, whether you're post-colonial or other, and I think that's not just business historians, it's anybody who's kind of interdisciplinary, and that the funders tell you they want interdisciplinary research, and that's great, but they mean something very specific by interdisciplinarity. And like most people working in a business school environment, we're pretty much all interdisciplinary because we're working with a number of different disciplines that just happen to exist in the business school. And then if we go beyond that, there's other disciplines. And my experience with both ERC, but also in the UK, UCRI, which is the national funder here, is if I submit to the historians, it's all too much business. And if I submit to business or even like economics or economic history, then it's all too much history. And it's just this extremely difficult bit. So ERC had a similar problem of, do you go to the management panel or the panel that appears to be the business and management panel with ERC? Well, basically, that's a bunch of economists. So if you're at a UK business school where there are lots of people from other disciplines, many of them qualitative, I mean, they basically have no chance on a panel full of economists who think that essentially business and management is, in Germany, is called BWL. It's basically business economics in their view. So this is incredibly difficult in practice to negotiate for people who do the kind of projects that they say they want, but in practice the evaluation means, oh, this is not quite invented here, this is not quite my field, so I don't really want to say yes to that.
Yeah, this is why I'm saying you need to make some time for it to really find out how you can carve your niche there, because I think why I was more successful the second round is not only because my CV spoke more clearly that I am the person, and there was kind of a correlation, or it was more balanced between my CV said better I am the kind of person to do the project that I also proposed. And I just had more experience to understand just how specific an idea needs to be. And in the second round, I had narrowed it down to one company and their factories in Africa, and not just that I want to generally look at industrialization in Africa, for example. And that was I think that was a huge success to make the project more tangible and sound more feasible. Also methodologically speaking, I can do comparison across countries, but I have a common denominator, which is the same multinational that is building these factories. And so, yeah, to study your panels. And I think what I had to do is I had to really find a completely new language for what I was doing, not trying to appeal to either of those fields you mentioned, but trying to appeal really to the interdisciplinary expert audience. But mind you, of course, you want to understand and which of these audiences, when we speak of the ERC panels, will be most likely to also read your CV. Yeah, will there be a bunch of publications where they will say, I have no idea, I've never heard of this journal, and it may be top ranked in your field, but the anthropologist in the human past panel has never ever heard of management or so. I wouldn't probably know. So I knew, and this is why I say, look at the people who are on the panel. Are these names you should at least know 3-4 of these names. And then you look them up and you see what journals do they publish. And like I said, this is a lot of homework. Yeah. And it gets complicated. But this is, I think, how you can sell or be able to place an interdisciplinary project by genuinely. And I think a person cannot really be as interdisciplinary as their project. I think that is just a fundamental thing, because if you want to advance your career, you have to stick to a trajectory of kind of journals that you publish in, a certain trajectory in the networks that you move in. So I'm talking here conferences, associations, and whatever. And yeah, I think in the particular context of a business school, it can be difficult because it maybe diverges a lot from the teaching that you do, or from what a lot of other colleagues you do, from the ref requirements or other kind of tenure requirements you might have. So again, I'm coming back to the 10 or so year strategy. It can be tricky to balance all of these things out, and only you will be in the position ultimately to understand whether this is actually feasible for you or not. And this is where I would also honestly say, maybe it's not for everyone. Or at what cost? Some people do immense things, and I just wonder, do they even have a private life? So that is, of course, also a personal decision people have to make. Do you basically want to invest your year's holiday to publish in a completely different field all the time? And it can be so tricky to also understand what publication count per year is successful. Varies greatly between the fields. Some want 4 or 5. Others are happy. The economists are happy if you do 1 working paper a year. And then every 3 years, you land in a top 5 journal. Totally different. I will say funny anecdote that one of the evaluations said, well, she has a monograph, which I know in many fields is totally irrelevant. I may as well not have like worked 5 years on the topic and then written it all up. So I haven't read it, so I can't really say whether it's good or not. That is literally what someone wrote in the evaluation. And also out of the 11 written assessments I got, at least 2 recommended not to fund the project. So there is a range, and I could kind of also sense different fields. If you want to get a better and more concrete idea, ask as many colleagues as you know to read their both successful and rejected grant applications. And this is also maybe a last thing I can say on understanding better what panel and what not. You should try get in touch with people who have been successful with the panel that you're considering, or with the ERC or whatever funding line, and ask them. And most of them will very readily, and I can say the same for me, they will share their grant proposals. And so you can analyze a little bit how you can map your own, how you can map your own CV onto this and onto this kind of project, and whether it could be a good fit or not, whether it's worth the effort. Is it like a gap you think you can close likely with the resources you have at hand at the moment, or is it not, and should you maybe look for a different funding line?
Great, thank you. We've got 5 more minutes. Any more questions? Now's your chance. Nope. Okay, well then, thank you very much, Marie. I think that was super insightful, and it's been really great that you were willing to share so many things about what works, what doesn't work, and how difficult that can be. I thought particularly the thing around your observation that very often what you find is, you know, the things you need to do for the grants don't necessarily align with what you need to do for your career, for your publications, for your workplace. So it's a real push sometimes, and maybe sometimes the question's also, is it the right timing for you to go for that size funding maybe, or for that type of funding? So thank you. That was super useful. And yeah, really appreciated that you made time to talk to us.
Thanks for the invite. It's, I've benefited a lot from I want to say that the ERC itself, and then a lot of other on the national level, there's so many resources that help you prepare and go for this ERC funding, because they know how difficult, how specific, how competitive it is. So they have a lot of like videos and webinars and whatever, so that really help you understand the process better. And then in addition to that, you're going to need to do proactively the work of reaching out to people in your field who have ERC grants, and then you learn from them. And I'm usually, like me, they're happy to share, I think, because it is a long journey. But yeah, don't neglect all the brilliant resources that the funders themselves also put out. In Germany, we have also on the national level, I had dozens of webinars then specifically drilling me for the interview and all this, just all this process. So look out.
Just a quick follow-up question, because you said you asked for successful grant applications in your field, but I think in field of business history, you're pretty much the first to get an ERC. I think there was an economic history one, but who did you ask? Because nobody who does similar research to you really had funding like this before.
So I can even give you their names. I asked Samuel Kocher, who has a research. So they were all from the field of African studies. And he has it's called Cattle Frontier. So he looks at cattle trade and the industries that kind of spawn from it. And then also Romain Tiquet, he had a grant on the history of madness in Africa. But I really learned from them. And with Samuel, I even helped him workshop his application at one point, because we know each other way back. And that was just helpful. For some people, I basically just from the outside, I looked at what grants do they have, what profile do they have. This is a lot of information. A lot of this type of information is usually accessible online. Yeah, you see their CVs, you see their publication lists, and you then see the kind of projects they're doing. And this, again, lots of homework. That's how it worked for me. Maybe other people did it differently, but yeah.
Thank you. Great tips. Thank you very much, Marie. Have a lovely rest of your day in DC, and everybody else who attended. I hope it was useful. Justin, who is in the BAM office, will send you a link where you can also see the recording. And if you have any feedback for us, whether this was helpful, what else you'd like to see, please let us know. Otherwise, thanks for joining us. In the chat, we've got LinkedIn details. Do leave yours if you want to connect, and we sort of try and reach out. So we're very happy to connect on LinkedIn and hopefully see you again for another event. Raphael, thank you. Glad it was useful for you. All right, have a lovely rest of the day. And Amar probably is going to bed because it is midnight over in China. So thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.